Good afternoon, everyone. So that was so incredibly kind. Thank you to Professor Person. It's been great having you it's been great getting to work with you over the past year with the Dean's Group. And I'm so flattered to be back at Rhodes College. I had a chance to meet many of the students and the faculty and staff here, and so a big thank you to the faculty and staff for inviting me back, for thinking of me to join you and to kick off our time together with this presentation. It's my first time speaking from a computer, but I just got some great emails yesterday and this morning that caused me to rethink my presentation. So I'm going to give you some of my freshest thinking. I was here in the fall, and when I was here in the fall, I was talking about 5 lenses for thinking about education and social justice. Some of you may have remembered that. So I had to come up with 5 new lenses. So the 5 new lenses I'm talking about today are actually coming from my newest book, which I'm trying to finish this year. And so hopefully it'll be helpful as we think about how we understand the moment that we're in and strategize or kind of problem solve as we imagine what the world could be. So why naming the moment? I'm really swayed by scholars like Paulo Freire, who talks about the need to name our reality or name the world. He tells us in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that before we jump into trying to change society or trying to come up with any kind of a solution, we need to first make certain that we understand the problem that we're trying to solve. Because if we don't take time to understand the problem for ourselves, what we often end up doing is buying into someone else's story of what the problem is, someone else's version. And that might mean that the solution we come up with might not be a solution at all. It might be highly counterproductive. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how often those of us who are trying to advocate for better schools, for better society, for justice, for democracy, for equity, sometimes our strategies or our solutions are doing precisely that. They're operating in quite contradictory, counterproductive ways because we haven't taken the time to really understand how we got here or what the here is. So this presentation is about trying to name the moment, is about trying to name the context that we're finding ourselves in. And why lenses? Why am I talking about 5 lenses for naming this moment? It's a story I want to tell. So one time I was going out to dinner with a couple of friends, and it was the beginning of the dinner hour, and we decided to go to this restaurant near the campus where we were working. This is when I used to work in Chicago. And so the restaurant had just opened for dinner. So there were like almost no one in the restaurant except one table where there was a couple sitting there. And so where did the host sit us? They sat us in the table right next to that table, which was extra awkward because I'm pretty sure they were on a first date and they were hardly talking, and it was like, oh, this is kind of awkward. But after the couple left, we were talking to each other. We were like, was that a first date? That was kind of awkward because, well, anyway, it doesn't matter what they were doing. But we were also saying, wasn't it awkward that they sat us right there? Like in this entire restaurant, why would you sit us right next to the only other occupied table? Like if it were me, I would sit us somewhere else. And if I were to choose where to sit, I would sit somewhere else. So we were kind of going off. My friend and the friend sitting across from me were like, yeah, that was really uncomfortable. Yeah, I wouldn't have done that. Yeah, that was really strange, wasn't it? And then all of a sudden, this friend sitting next to her said, well, how is it when you guys go into a movie theater? Like, what's the normal thing to do? Because my sense is in the US, she didn't grow up in the US. In the US, if you walk into a movie theater and there's one person sitting in the theater, what do we do? Well, I don't know what you all do. But when I walk into a movie theater and there's someone sitting there, I'll sit, several seats or several rows away from that person. Like, I won't walk up and sit right next to that person. And she's like, well, so here's the thing. Where I grew up, this is a country in Asia, the polite and proper thing to do is to sit right next to that person. And why? Well, there's actually cultural and contextual reasons why. Right? This is a very crowded city. And when you walk into a movie theater, the movie theaters are always jam-packed. So in some ways, it makes a lot of sense within that cultural context that you would sit in the middle and you would gradually space out. It's almost rude to sit with like two seats between you, because then someone has to do the thing where they're like, could you raise your hand if there's a seat next to you and your neighbor, right? You don't have to do that because everyone has thoughtfully filled out the seats as they're moving along. This is a lens that we look through, right? We're always looking through these lenses to make sense of the world around us. My lens for where is the proper place to sit in a restaurant is informed by my experiences, just as her lens for where to sit in the movie theater. And the point I'm trying to make isn't that her lens is better than mine. My point is that we're all looking through a partial lens. We're all looking through a lens that has been colored by our life experiences, our cultural background, our educational preparation, our professional training, all of this, right? And too often, we either don't recognize that we're all looking through different lenses, or maybe we do, and the even bigger problem is we're demanding that everyone should be looking through mine. Our job is actually to recognize that every lens is partial. Our job is to actually try to assess how any lens makes it possible to see certain things but not see others. So in this presentation, what I'm going to try to do is invite us to try on 5 different lenses to see if it helps us to understand the problems with more complexity and to imagine the solutions with more creativity. So the first lens I want to talk about is why are we here? My lenses come in the form of questions. Why are we here? We sometimes fail to ask the big questions. Isn't this what we talk about in education all the time? Let's get our students to talk about the big questions, right? I don't just want to debate this particular policy. I want to debate this kind of larger social problem that this policy reflects. What is the bigger challenge that we need to be addressing? Okay, so let me illustrate this lens with a story about my family. I have so many stories I could share about my family. But this one will be about this summer. So I'm going back. I grew up in Hawaii, and my entire extended family is there. And usually when I go back to Hawaii, I do a sleepover with my nephew, who's like 13. He's this young, I was going to say nerdy version of me, but more accurately, he's a young version of the nerdy me, because I'm no less nerdy than he is. But we always do things together, right? He likes to play chess like I like to play chess. He likes to play the ukulele like I like to play the ukulele. All right, but this summer, my point is that we can't do the sleepover. Why? Because the week that I'm there, he is taking an accelerated course at the community college. So he's about to become a freshman in high school. And they set up this honors program where he can take courses at the community college that becomes college credit that's applicable for when he goes to college. Exciting, many of us would say, right? But it does make me wonder, why do we do that? So it's really important to think about how to make college more affordable. But if we provided education for all, which we should do, and which many countries do, including at the higher education level, and if we didn't treat education as a commodity, something that you need to buy and bargain for, then would the goal simply be to get that degree as quickly as we can? It reminds me of yesterday, one of the stories that I read that caused me to rethink my talk a little bit was I was reading a story about how this collection of schools, of high schools, are going to phase out the AP exams. And the argument is that there's become such a focus on this high-stakes test preparation that it's preventing them from actually teaching, from doing what we know we need to be doing in classes, right? That it's more and more geared towards high-stakes test preparation. Okay. And this raises, again, this very difficult dilemma of trying to educate in a way that doesn't prohibit college because it's so expensive, but also asking, well, why do we go to school in the first place, right? So here's the context that I want to try to connect the dots with, and that is a reform initiative in education that should sound like an initiative from decades ago, but it's taking on new life today, and it's called competency-based education. Competency-based education. competency-based education is a form of education that often is through online for-profit providers that promises a degree in as little as maybe 3 months. Why? Because their job is to give all kinds of credit, especially life credit, right? Credit for areas in which you can demonstrate competency. So if you can demonstrate competency in this area of math, you should be able to get credit for it. If you can demonstrate competency in this area of accounting, you should be able to get credit for that. And their job is to just sort of certify all the ways in which you actually are qualified, the ways in which you already know the content. Does everyone see that the education institution is more about certifying what you know or don't know rather than about providing an educational experience, right? And this is why it's possible to get a bachelor's degree in like 3 months. Why? Because their job is simply to test and test until you can show that you know, rather than to provide an experience. And so this is the contrast then that I want to provide about education that's simply about getting a college degree as quickly or as affordably as you can, is really to ask the question, why education or why schools? I was once at a conference where one of the people in the audience was like, yeah, I actually think this is a question that educators should be asking our students every day. Like, why are we here? Why are we learning this, right? And if you can't answer that question, or if you're buying into someone else's version of what the answer should be, then are we really teaching people to think? Are we in schools merely to demonstrate that we know something so that we can get somewhere else? Are we in schools just to get to college? Are we in schools just to get a job? Are we in schools just to get a higher paying job, right? Or are we in schools for for a much bigger purpose? And if we look at the history of schooling throughout the United States, one thing that we'll see is that we've debated this question since the very beginning of schools. We've always been debating why schools, right? Is it about job preparation? Is it about socialization and helping everyone to fit into the world? Is it about global competitiveness so that we can beat out all other countries? Is it about making more money? Or is it about freedom and liberation and flourishing in life? These are the many ways, and there are probably many others, of how people have talked about why schools. And what an interesting question, right? Nowadays, I like to, when I run workshops, pause and ask, well, why do you think we should have schools? And it's interesting, not only to hear the debate, but to hear how rarely we pause to ask ourselves that question. So why are we here is the first question, right? How did we get here is the second question I want to ask. How did we get here is a reminder that we need to look at history. That too often we try to talk about the problems we're encountering without recognizing what preceded today that might complicate our analysis. So here's a story from yesterday that I want to talk about as well. And it's a news release that came out from one of my favorite media organizations called the Institute for Public Accuracy. The Institute for Public Accuracy. Accuracy.org, I think is their website. But anyway, Institute for Public Accuracy, IPA, they send out these news releases several times a day that's trying to get a kind of a counter perspective into the media. It's trying to say the mainstream media seems preoccupied with this version of the story, so here are some other people that might give another perspective. And what was the story about yesterday? It was about what is dominating the media today. One of the stories that's dominating the media today is the separation of children at the borders, right? So undocumented families are crossing over, and ICE agents are pulling children out of the arms of their parents. Okay. So there are many on the right who are trying to argue, who are trying to kind of give an analysis about what's happening, right? They're talking about what the case law is saying. They're talking about what federal regulations are saying. They're talking about what preceded Trump. But the interesting article yesterday is from this very left-leaning organization, IPA, which was actually making a very similar argument. That there's a reporter that they quote who has documented throughout the Obama years the same thing happening. Children being pulled out of the arms of their parents at borders. There's also stories of what's being called the cages, right? The cages, right, where you have lots of young children, minors, being squished into a room, often separated by a screen, a metal screen, hence the name of a cage. Do we have photos of things like that before Trump? Did they suddenly build it in like a few days in order to put kids in cages? Or did those facilities pre-exist Trump? And were we squeezing families and children in those spaces before Trump? Well, the answer is actually yes, we were. Maybe not at the level that we're seeing now, but atrocities were happening. And why I bring this up is because sometimes we're so quick to say that this moment is unusual, that this leader is horrible. This leader might be horrible, but you miss the picture if you don't understand how we got here, and that maybe both sides of the political party are responsible for what's happening now. This reminds me of an article that came out last year in the midst of Betsy DeVos being confirmed, or actually this was after she was confirmed. So she was now Secretary of Education, and one of the biggest names in education who was a former undersecretary, Diane Ravitch, right? Diane Ravitch used to be this very conservative thinker, and now many identify her with the liberals. But she came up with this article titled, "Don't Like Betsy DeVos? Blame the Democrats." And what her article is trying to say is that the Democrats laid the groundwork for what's happening now under the Trump-DeVos administration. What are some of the things that we're saying is so problematic about the Trump-DeVos policies in education? Things like privatization and marketization, things like the expansion of school choice and charter schools, things like diverting federal funds to expand voucher programs, including in voucher-like programs like education savings accounts. That was happening all under Obama. In fact, it was under the Obama and Duncan tenure that we saw the policies that did some of the greatest contribution to privatizing public education, which was Race to the Top, right? I'm not saying that they're equal. I'm saying there's precedent. I'm not saying that things were always this bad. I'm saying that both sides have contributed to the problem. And if we don't understand how we got here, we can't actually fix the bigger problem. Okay, so let's go even more further back in history. So we talk a lot about vouchers. And right now, Arizona. So there's a federal push, right? Under the kind of tax bills, under different kinds of federal legislation, we see a lot of conversation about school vouchers. Everyone understands what school vouchers is? So you have school choice is typically this umbrella where you can choose what school you go to. And sometimes that refers to school choice within the public sector. But vouchers helps us to expand school choice to the private sector by saying that the money that would have followed you to the school, at least some of it, would follow you to pay for tuition at a private school, right? Well, a version of that is called the education savings account, right? Which is where you can often put what would have been tax money or into tax shelters or whatever. You're basically taking benefiting from tax laws to use money to pay for private schools. All right, so Arizona is considering this right now. Okay? So what I wanted to say though is that vouchers, as probably everyone in here knows, didn't arise in the Trump or DeVos administration. It actually dates back more than half a century. So where did we first see vouchers entering the public debate over education? Well, it was actually in the post-Brown era, right? So 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? And this is where the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools are unconstitutional, that schools need to desegregate. And for about 10 years, we actually didn't do very much at all to desegregate schools. It really wasn't until Civil Rights Act and then Elementary and Secondary Education Act when we began to see desegregation happening in the mid-1960s. But what I want to bring up is that there are people making the argument in the years following Brown, particularly in the 1960s, as desegregation began to pick up speed. There are people making the argument that we don't need mandatory desegregation programs if we can simply give people choice, right? Oh, I'm talking about choice, not vouchers. So let me finish my choice story. So there are people arguing, right, that you don't need mandatory desegregation programs if you can simply put into place choice programs. Because the argument was that if everyone had the choice of where to send their schools, that regardless of your racial background, cultural background, geographic location, everyone is going to be trying to get their kids into the top performing schools. In other words, school choice is a way to organically or naturally desegregate schools. That was the argument being made back then, right? Choice was never a way to improve education. Choice originally emerged as a way to avoid desegregation, or at least mandatory desegregation programs. And the research is also pretty clear, right? That where we've seen school choice programs, you don't actually see desegregation. You tend to see increased segregation. But I meant to talk about vouchers. So let's talk about vouchers. So vouchers also dates back about half a century. And who was some of the main earliest proponents, loud proponents of school vouchers? Well, it would be economists like Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys, or basically this kind of cadre of economists that he was helping to train at the University of Chicago. So Friedman is quoted, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but you can Google him, as saying something like vouchers are not an end, they're actually a means to an end. So what is it that he was hoping that vouchers would help us to accomplish? Well, his argument was that vouchers can help us to privatize education, right? His argument was that public schools are failing, and it's failing because the public sector has failed. So what we need to do is move away from the public sector and move into the private sector. We need to marketize, right? And it's kind of like grocery stores in a neighborhood. If you have people competing with one another, it's the effort and the innovation that's going to drive improvement. Right? And this is the whole philosophy behind a marketplace mentality, is that if you can treat things like they're in a market system where you're forced to compete, well, that forcing of competition is what should make everyone try harder and get better. And sadly, we have lots of research that shows that when you marketize education systems, it can actually make things far worse. I'm thinking of the work by people like Naomi Klein, who talks about marketizing schools in Latin America throughout the 1970s, right? All right. So my point, as we think about how we get here, we actually need to be thinking about what has become the common sense of our times. What have we become so used to thinking over the past years or even decades that we fail to question? This idea, by the way, that markets will solve all of our problems, there's a name for it. In the 1980s, we began to call this the Washington Consensus, right? And part of the Washington Consensus, the consensus between Democrats and Republicans, was the idea that if you can marketize a system, it's that free market that's going to drive improvement. And so I like to ask people, well, what has become so commonsensical today that we're not questioning it, right? And there's a lot of things in education that seems to be so commonsensical that we're not questioning, right? Like test scores will tell us everything we need to know, so we're going to make all kinds of big decisions on tests. Or competition will drive improvement. So we're going to have school choice programs. We're going to have alternative routes to teacher certification. We're going to have competitive grants as a way to totally revamp how we do federal funding, right? These are all based on markets, on neoliberalism. But there's so many other ideas. So sometimes I run a workshop and I'm just like, let's brainstorm what has become commonsensical. We won't do that right now, but just as a quick example, one brainstorm would be, the older you get, the more likely you are to experience a classroom that looks like this, where the vast majority of people are sitting and there's someone at the front who thinks he knows more and he's just talking the whole time, right? As if that's the most effective way to teach. We don't do this with 5-year-olds. We think it's an effective way with adults, but with adults, it's not necessarily any more effective. What research tells us is that our brains are constantly going off on digressions, right? We're constantly, that makes me think about da-da-da-da-da. That's happening all the time when we're listening, right? So why do we think it's so effective to stand in front of a room and talk nonstop? I won't talk nonstop for much longer, but I think it's important to ask, right? What has become so commonsensical that we're not questioning, right? And too often, one of the ways that we fail to question the common sense of our times is we fail to question how that common sense evolved. We fail to question history. We also fail to look at the bigger picture in terms of systems. So this gets to my third question, is how are we defining the problem? Too often we talk about the problem in terms of individuals, rather than looking at the systems in which the individuals operate. We blame individuals instead of looking at broken systems. So an example I like to give, since I live in California, is the drought. We talk a lot about how we're in this historic drought in California. And so every time we talk about the drought, what is it that we say we need to do? We say you need to take shorter showers and turn off the water when you're, well, this isn't about power. Oh yeah, this is. Take shorter showers and turn off the water when you're brushing your teeth, you know, like wet your brush and then turn off the water and then turn it on when you need to rinse. Don't wash your car all the time. And, you know, brown is beautiful. You know, we have all the signs in California. Have you all seen the signs in California? Brown is beautiful. We put that on the brown lawns because we're not supposed to water our lawns, right? Yes, systems. So, point I'm trying to make is, did you all see the film that came out about a decade ago called An Inconvenient Truth? An Inconvenient Truth was about climate change, right? And it starred Al Gore. And for, you know, about 99% of that film, I was loving this documentary. I'm like, yes, this is raising problems about how our planet is being destroyed. Does everyone remember how this film ends? So at the very end, there's this black screen with a scroll of, it's a scrolling list of all the things that we can do to prevent the further destruction of the climate. And what is it? It's listing all the things that we individually can do, right? You need to carpool, you need to turn off the lights, you need to use fluorescent bulbs, right? Even though a lot of the film actually had nothing to do with individual usage, a lot of the film had to do with kind of system and societal things. And in fact, there's a whole book, Naomi Klein's latest book, This Changes Everything, which says what is the major culprit of climate change? It's not individual consumption, it's actually capitalism, right? By the way, speaking about the drought, just going back to California, so some interesting stats, right? Individual household consumption. The amount of water that individual people use accounts for what percentage of water usage in California? Let's brainstorm. What percentage? 10, 20? No, but thank you for the guess. It's actually around 5. It's actually around 5. Almonds account for 10 maybe? Alfalfa around 10? What's the industry that accounts for 47%, by the way? Cows. Cow production. Meat, dairy, all of that. Partly because they use one of the most water-intensive crops to feed the cows, which is alfalfa. All right, what was my point? We can all stop taking showers altogether, right? And it's not actually going to make much of a dent in the drought in California. We actually have to address the much bigger system, right? Not just blaming individuals. Some of you know I wrote a book called Bad Teacher, which is all about how we tend to talk about the problems in education by blaming individual teachers rather than by looking at how the system itself is broken. All right, so there's one other way that I want to talk about broken systems though, and that is by talking about, again, some of my latest thinking. One of the things I'm obsessed about today is hate speech and free speech. So let's talk a little bit about this as a way to talk about systems. So there are several ways that some people argue for protecting hate speech while censoring any speech that is critical of hate. So we want to protect people who want to say things that some consider racist, but when you call someone out on racist, then suddenly we're censoring them, and so we need to be censored. That's what I want. I want to get at this dilemma, right? Does that dilemma make sense? All right, because I think we're just, you know, Google Berkeley censorship, and you'll come up with all kinds of things about how Berkeley is one of the centerpieces, right, of universities where this kind of debate is happening. All right, so what are the arguments people make for why anyone should be able to say anything, even if it's hateful? Let me give 3 major arguments people make. One is a political argument. All sides should have equal voice in a democracy. Have we heard this? Yeah, we even hear this in a classroom. What is a fair debate? It's where everyone can say what they think. Okay, that was my first point. Second point is there's a pedagogical reason people make this argument, which is that all learners need to self-disclose, and then we can process all sides rationally. We've heard educators make this argument as well, right? You need to put your feelings out there before we can deconstruct it, right? And therefore, the classroom needs to be a space where everyone can say what they're actually thinking. the argument is kind of an interesting pedagogical argument, right? That maybe you can't really unlearn your racism until you first express it. Okay, we've heard people say that, right? Or at least some of us have. Here's a third argument people make. It's an ontological one. If I can't express myself, then I can't really be me. Okay, in all three instances, not being able to voice your hate and or having to hear someone's critique of you is said to injure. Not being able to say what I really think is a way of injuring me, right? Or having to hear you critique me and call me out as racist is an injury to me, right? So that's the rationale that people use for these three arguments. Okay. So let me try to draw on work that actually came out about a quarter century ago by legal scholars and by scholars of rhetoric to talk about how we can more understand speech in a more complicated way, and then to pick apart these two arguments. I want to make two responses. One is that speech can vary in how it functions. Speech can vary in function. Let's talk about 4 examples of this. One, 4 ways that speech can function. Okay? So the first way that speech can function is as representation. This is where my speech is a way of transmitting my idea to you. Right? So speech in this way is thought of as something that is transparent and communicative. Speech is used to communicate what's in my head to get it into your head. Okay? That's probably the most common way that we talk about speech. Second way, though, that speech can function is as provocation. Where speech isn't really about communicating. Speech is about invoking. It's about trying to get a particular response from you. So when I make a joke, that's speech as provocation. When I emote feelings because I want sympathy, that's speech as provocation. There's this wonderful article that was written in 1994, those of you who are ed researchers, by Michelle Foster. You may remember this article that was something about, like, the power to know isn't the power to know. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the title, but it's about this article she wrote on her study of black teachers, and she saw herself as black. And what she argues is that the early interviews she did with her teachers was not really, you couldn't take what they said at face value. What she was arguing was that at first, when they were first having conversation, when they were answering her questions, they weren't necessarily answering her questions. They were actually testing her. And isn't this something we do all the time? When you first meet someone, you say something and you're kind of gauging how they respond to see if you can trust them. And once you figure out that you can trust them, then you actually are more likely to say what you're really thinking, right? So she's raising the possibility that many times when we're in a conversation, it's not speech as representation, it's speech as provocation. It's speech where I'm saying something because I'm trying to gauge something in you, right? And by the way, this just means that if you take everything someone says as a researcher, you record them, and then you quote from them, and you say, they said this must mean this is what they really think. Foster's argument is that's a really big problem, because many times we say something in an interview that has nothing to do with what we really think, right? Which gets at my third way that we use speech, which is a speech as performance. Speech as performance. We do this in theater all the time, where I'm speaking not as if I'm me, as if I'm not me, right? I'm putting on a role, right? But in education, this happens all the time as well, right? Really good students are those who can perform really well because they know what it means to perform the good student. They know how to answer questions correctly. It may not be at all what they think. It may be what they know will get them the A. This is an example of speech as performance, right? And finally, speech as performative. Sorry for the jargon, but those of you who are post-structural scholars, you will know a performative, right, is where my action constitutes me, or my speech is itself constitutive. So what's an example that Judith Butler likes to give? So Judith Butler is one of the theorists who likes to say, gender and even bodily sex is a social construct. These do not exist outside of social meaning, right? What does it mean to be a girl? You actually have to learn what it means to be a girl throughout your life. So So that's a whole nother conversation. But the point I want to make about speech is, the example she gives is when you're born, what does the doctor say? It says, it's a girl. That's the beginning of the social construction of you as a girl. And throughout your life, we girl you. We make you into a girl in all sorts of ways, right? We tell you how to dress, we tell you how to behave, we tell you what's expected of you, we tell you who you're supposed to date, blah, 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 right? This is the social construction. Speech is a part of social construction. Speech constructs us, right? All right, what's the note that I want to make about this? The law does prohibit certain instances of speech. It prohibits speech as representation, certain kinds of representational speech. Like it says you cannot lie in court. That's an example of prohibiting speech as representation. It also prohibits instances of speech as provocation. You cannot walk into a crowded movie theater, and yell fire. You'll actually be charged with civil disruption, or I don't know what technically you'd be disrupted for. But why? Because that yelling will actually cause people to panic and rush to the door. People will get injured. And can you be blamed and held liable? Actually, you can. The law does prohibit certain performances, right? Or it protects certain performances, like whistleblowing, right? Whistleblowing is actually protected, or it should be, under the law. We know that it's prosecuted anyway. It also can protect certain performatives. Like the best example would be the Clinton era don't ask, don't tell, right? Where coming out, a constitutive act, right, was protected, right? Well, I'm sorry, it was supposed to be protected, even though what we know is that criminalization went up. Okay, but the law pretended to protect, right? In all of these instances, does everyone see, though, that speech is being narrowed to the Speech Act? In all of these instances, the law focuses on the utterance. All right, so this then leads to my second point, which is where I'm going to try to complicate how we understand speech, which is that speech is more than the utterance. Speech can vary in meaning and impact, is my second point. I said my first point is that it can vary in function. My second point is that it can vary in meaning and impact. What's an example of this? When I was growing up, I don't think people say this anymore, so I'll date myself a little bit, but sometimes when you wanted to say something was good, you said, no, something was really bad. So if I really liked a movie, I would say, oh, that movie was really bad. And you were supposed to know that that movie was good, right? What's the point I'm trying to make with that example? Is that language does not have essential meaning. So this is what scholars of rhetoric, scholars of language, and even scholars of law would argue, right? Is that there's no meaning embedded in the language. You put several letters together, it doesn't suddenly have essential meaning. Meaning is constructed. Meaning comes about because that utterance cites a particular, what we would call discursive history. It cites a history of how that utterance has been interpreted over time, right? So within a particular community, words begin to be used in repetitive ways, and a shared understanding of the usage of that word begins to evolve. It's why in different linguistic communities, that same utterance can have a very different meaning, right? Because what gives words meaning is that it cites discursive histories, okay? The impact of words or utterances can also vary. What's an example? That's so gay. That's so gay can be a very hurtful phrase. But some of you probably know that among LGBT people, or particularly LG people, that's so gay can be kind of a playful or even flattering word. That is so gay. When talking about someone's outfit, like saying, oh, that is so awesome, right? So it can be hurtful, it can be flattering. The impact can vary, in other words, depending on the context, right? But more importantly, it can vary because of the power relations embedded in different discursive communities, right? Power relations within any context will help us understand the impact that the utterance will have, right? This is why not all speech is equal. Some speech can actually cause more harm than others. And this is also why some speech is more in need of protection, while other speech is more in need of amplification. So one of the best-known legal scholars on speech is Mari Matsuda. a legal scholar at the University of Hawaii, one of the founding thinkers of critical race theory. And this is her argument, right? Is that because of power relations, speech can have different impact. And therefore, because not all speech is equal, what we actually need to think about is, well, then which speech is in need of protection, right? Even in a shared discourse community, the meaning or impact can vary because of the different lenses we use. So just to even further complicate this, we can all be in the same community and understand that when I say a movie is bad, that I mean it's good. But let's also keep in mind that every single one of us is looking through a different lens. It's like the three friends of us, that when my three friends and I went to a restaurant and we were seated next to the table, we all are interpreting that context, that event differently, right? Because we're all looking through a different lens. Same discursive community, different lens of interpretation, right? So, bringing this all back to the law then. The law does recognize that words wound, but Matsuda and other scholars like Judith Butler would argue that the law falls short because it presumes that the originator of the meaning or the harm is the speaker. Who's to blame for the harm? It's the speaker, because the speaker is leveraging that language, right? And so what does the law do? It silences speakers in order to prevent harmful speech, or it punishes them after they speak. And what scholars would argue is that what you actually need to do is recognize what gives words power to begin, meaning in the first place. It's not the speaker, it's actually the discursive histories in which they arise. It's the systems, right? We actually need to be tackling power, in other words, not simply censoring individuals. So that was a very long about way of talking about individual versus system, but hopefully that helps to illustrate, right, that even in something as complicated as speech law, what we have to remind ourselves is that so long as we overly focus on the role of individuals, we may never actually tackle the much deeper problem of broken systems, right? The much deeper problem of inequitable power relations and the histories that give those relations such force. So this gets to my fourth lens about how are we defining solutions. Number 3 was how are we defining problems. Number 4 is how are we defining solutions. And here I want to talk about how we are often buying into someone else's stories, and therefore we're coming up with solutions that are counterproductive. So let's talk about what's happening in education as an example of that. So in education, we often talk about teachers very paradoxically, in very contradictory ways. We talk about teachers in ways that are undervaluing them and in ways that are overvaluing them. So what's an example? Let's talk about several well-known educators or education leaders or people who fancy themselves as education leaders. So we've heard people demonize teachers. Remember when Rod Page said that the union was a Secretary of Education, Rod, called the Teachers Union a terrorist organization? Michelle Rhee, the former chancellor of DC Public Schools, how did she make her name? She made her name by saying schools are failing, and why are they failing? Because there are too many lazy and incompetent teachers. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to fire all the bad ones, right? And in fact, there's a cover of her on a major news magazine where she's, I know, I'm that upset too. Yes, where she's carrying a broom, and she's described as kind of the poster child of these new age of education reformers. And there was no evidence that she actually raised achievement or attainment or anything. What's the evidence that she's a new era of reformers? Is that she fired a whole bunch of teachers and principals, right? So even the story was buying into the story, was buying into the narrative. Even the news article was buying into the underlying story that schools are failing, and they're failing because we have too many lazy and incompetent teachers, right? But at the same time that we're demonizing teachers, we're actually on the kind of flip side of the same coin, we're also glorifying teachers. So Obama and Duncan would make statements like the single most important thing that every child needs for a great education is a great teacher in every classroom, right? And this is also buying into the story that education is all about the teacher. And I'm not going to argue that the teacher is unquestionably the most important thing. But if you're saying that education is all about the teacher, that if we have a successful school system, that means we have great teachers, that also means that if we have a broken school system, that it's because of the teachers. And I think many of us would argue that we've had a broken school system since we created it. We created the school system to be broken, right? We created a school system for only the most elite in this country. And as we are forced to integrate more and more, we just came up with more and more ways to divide and sort them. Our schools have always played a sorting and socializing role in this society. And if you are a scholar of international or comparative education, you'll see that around the world, when countries develop mass schooling systems, it happens in two phases, either the time of colonialism or the time of industrialization and urbanization, right? So you're either creating a mass schooling system for the people outside your country or the mass schooling system for the growing masses within, right? And in both cases, what's one of the major purposes of mass schooling? It's socialization, right? All right, so are we going to blame teachers for all that's good or bad? The notion that the solution is all about the teacher is reflected in some policy initiatives, right? So an example would be, if a teacher is smart, let's try it again. If a teacher knows math, then they're qualified to teach math. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. But that should sound like something that actually policymakers have been saying for a while. This was kind of language used in No Child Left Behind, in terms of the highly qualified teacher. States like Wisconsin, they're bringing back initiatives like the Passport to Teaching. You all remember from 10 years ago, the American Board for Certification of Teaching Excellence, ABCTE. Many of us thought this died. Because a lot of states began to disprove of it. But ABCTE is all about saying, if you have a college degree in a content area, you can get initial certification, right? Because that's all you need to be able to teach, right? Which, by the way, higher ed kind of unfortunately echoes that idea, right? We don't teach professors how to teach. We hire them because you're supposed to be really smart in your content, and then we assume that that means you can teach. So unfortunately, higher ed echoes that story. But my point is that one of the ideas is that if you're smart on content, then you can teach. So what's a problem here? A problem is that our obsession with individual output detracts from broken systems, right? Let's go back to the solution. The solution is all about the individual. If a teacher is smart, then they can raise achievement. But it goes higher than that, right? It goes beyond that. It also says that, therefore, how do you evaluate that a teacher is effective? Well, you look at achievement. And so all this value-added stuff that the Department of Education is talking about is all about looking at student achievement in order to see whether or not teachers are performing well, right? We're going to evaluate teachers based on gains and test scores. We're talking about whether a teacher is qualified based on whether they can raise test scores, rather than talking about whether teachers are qualified because they're contributing to or hampering the ability of schools to educate, right? We're not looking at the system, we're only looking at individuals. Part of my argument here is that by ignoring complexity, what we end up often doing is exacerbating the idea that we're in a crisis. We end up manufacturing a sense of crisis, right? And this was the book from the 1990s, Manufactured Crisis. That sometimes, it's not to say that we aren't in a crisis, it's to say that how you spell out that crisis might actually give justification for pushing through some really problematic solutions, right? Okay, so my one quick example on this. California is talking about a teacher shortage, like many places across the country. And we make the argument that why is there a teacher shortage? Because the cost of living is so high in San Francisco. That's how one reporter wanted to present this story. He's interviewing me. He's like, it's because the cost of living is too high, right? And I'm like, actually, I think there's like 7 other factors for the teacher shortage. And so I'm giving my 20-minute spiel, and then I watch the interview. And you can kind of guess, right? You know how you give a 20-minute interview and then you're quoted for like half a sentence, and what was my quote? It's the cost of living. And I was like, oh, dude, you did not need to interview me for that. But my point is, right, that when we get the sense that we're in a shortage, we then turn to these quick fixes. And what was the school district proposing as a quick fix? It was Teach for America. And why I think that's so problematic, although I think there are awesome people going through Teach for America, but the problem is you're then replacing teachers who've been in the classroom for decades with teachers who are only promising to be in there for a few years. You're going to exacerbate the problem with your solution. The solution cannot be simply getting in individual bodies. It needs to be looking at the system that you're building. All right, finally then, my last lens is how shall we educate for democracy? Part of what I've been trying to argue throughout my presentation is that we need to be rattling what has become the common sense of our times. And we can do that in a number of ways. We can do that by looking at systems. We can do that by looking at history. We can do that by just kind of questioning what has become commonsensical in this moment. But there are certain terms in particular that I think we need to be tackling. Terms like success, terms like democracy, and terms like education. Let me take each of these really quickly, 1 minute each. Success. One of my favorite books that I came across recently is called The Queer Art of Failure. Anyone? Anyone seen this? The Queer Art of Failure by Halberstam makes the argument that too often we say, why is failing good? Failing is good because if you try hard, if you just try and try again, eventually you'll succeed. Why is failing good? Because it helps us eventually to succeed. And Halberstam wants to argue, well, maybe that's not really the right way to think about it. Maybe failing is good because it gives us a different perspective on how the majority is defining success, right? This is kind of the queer theory argument, right? Queer theory was a response to gay rights activists who are saying, we're as normal as you are. This is the message from the 1950s. We gay people, we're as normal as you straight people. The queer activists who came around in the 1980s said, maybe that's the wrong message. Maybe we shouldn't say we're as normal as you. Maybe what we should be saying is, there's something wrong with how you're defining normalcy. And I think same with Halberstam's argument of success, that maybe success too often demands assimilation. Maybe failing is a standpoint from which to question success, right? Which, by the way, goes back to what I was saying earlier about what often defines success. What often defines success is a student's ability to perform in ways that best assimilate to mainstream definitions of the good student. Democracy. Second point that I want to trouble, right? Let's pick elected school boards, because this is a big thing right now. All the progressive activists like myself were like, let's get rid of mayoral appointed school boards. There's no accountability. That's not democratic. We need elected school boards. All right, what percentage of those who vote, what percentage of the kind of voting public participates in school board elections? It's actually only around 10. Right? So who's voting? This is why it's so easy to take over a school board, right? It's because no one's voting in these elections. Is this really more democratic? I'm not saying we should have mayoral. I think that's even more. Mayoral controlled, I think that's even less democratic. But I came across another book recently called Against Elections. Anyone? Against Elections? I would say add this to your must-read pile. It's such an interesting book. It's a book that's basically making the argument that only since the last 2 centuries or so, since the American and French revolutions, have we equated democracy with electoral democracies, right? That the 3 millennia that preceded had all forms of other democracies that were much more direct. In other words, there were much more, many people just rotating in and out through lottery systems, right? And why did we create an electoral democracy? Why did the French and American people, the French revolutions and the American revolutions, why did they move towards electoral democracies? Well, wasn't it to limit who can be in leadership positions and who can even vote in them? Right? This wasn't actually a move towards more democracy. It was a much more powerful and smart move towards elitism, right? So his argument is that we not should totally get rid of elections. His argument is that we should question how they arose. And do they always equal a more democratic form of governance? If we really want to think about democracy, what would a more direct or representational democracy look like, right? And then finally, education. Are we questioning what we mean by education? I think 90-something% of teacher ed programs teach teachers to teach in the way that's called backward design. Here's the objective, where I want students to learn, and then I'm going to figure out the activity to get them there. This is how I teach. It's how I teach teachers to teach. So I actually think it's an important way to learn to teach. But does that leave space for students to question what the very things that teachers are teaching? And part of what I try to argue in my work on curriculum is that if we're simply getting students to think like me, that is no more or less oppressive than teaching students to think in the most dominant and hegemonic and oppressive way out there, right? Our job actually needs to get students to question, to think for themselves, to critique even the things that we knowledgeable, progressive, social justice people are trying to teach. And that means teaching in a much more paradoxical, contradictory way than what we often think teaching means. Let's rattle the concepts of success, democracy, and education. Let's rattle what has become the common sense of our times, and let's see if that invites us to create an education system that more creatively advances democracy and social justice for all? These are some of the questions and opportunities and challenges that I urge us to grapple with as we engage in this important work, and I hope that this presentation helps in that effort. So thanks very much. Okay, I actually did go way over, so I did keep you waiting, but I hope that was helpful. Yeah, we're out of time, right?
Well, do you want to take a question?
Do you want me to take a couple questions? Sure, yeah.
Question.
Okay, when you rattle these things you talked about, there are entrenched and powerful interests behind those things. So how do you deal with those?
Yeah. Yeah. There are interests invested in all of these ideas and structures. And in many ways, we too are all invested. It's become how we live. It's become our common sense. And we're often invested in our ways of living. This isn't exactly a direct answer, but here's what you're making me think of. So one of my favorite works is a short book by George Lakoff called Don't Think of an Elephant. Many of you are familiar with. So Lakoff is a sociolinguist professor at Berkeley. And the title comes from him sometimes walking into his class and saying, all right, I want you all not to think of an elephant. And you're all like, oh, I'm thinking of an elephant. And he's like, yes, that's my point, right? That how I begin a conversation or a debate will shape the ways that you engage in that conversation. And a lot of his work tries to think about how different debates are framed. And his argument is that we need to be better, we progressives need to be better at framing the debate, right? That too often we buy into someone else's frame. And a good example that I'm compelled by is, some of you may remember about like 20, 25 years ago when we were talking about tax cuts. You remember that we all were using the term tax relief. Maybe not all of us, but that was a term that was used in debates around tax cuts. And why is that so brilliant? Because if I'm not for big tax cuts, then the most I can debate with you is whether to give you a little bit of relief or a lot of relief, right? His argument is just don't just dive into the debate in the terms that someone else has framed. You actually need to reframe it using a different conceptual metaphor, a different conceptual framework. Now, I'm swayed by his work. But one of the criticisms of his work is that aren't we simply trying to, out-strategize someone else in terms of like propaganda, in terms of like, you're just being more creative. You're just being more seductive. But are you actually getting people to think? Our job isn't simply to reframe. Our job actually is to get people to question frames, right? Just like with teaching. A lot of my work has to do with how, at a subconscious level, we don't actually desire learning complexity, right? So I'm really swayed by theorists who say, at a subconscious level, what do we desire? We desire simplicity. We desire closure. We desire a sense of completeness. And many times, we desire repetition. We desire something that affirms what we already know. I like picking up a book and saying, oh, I always thought that was the case. And look, Natalie says that right here. Like, if I'm in a conversation and you're telling me something that's making me uncomfortable, I usually don't go, yeah, that's making me uncomfortable. Tell me more and make me more uncomfortable. My response is usually to shut down, right? So if what we desire is affirmation and what we resist is actually something quite troubling, our goal shouldn't be to simply give us something more comfortable. Our goal should actually get us to want something much more troubling. And same with kind of the critique of Lakoff, right? The critique of Lakoff is we need the better frame, but we also need to get people to desire something much more complicated, something much more complex. So this is my long-winded way of saying that I think part of our job isn't simply to come up with a better system. Part of our job is actually to get people to want a better system, a different system. And how do we do that when we're all so invested in it? Well, I think that's where education plays such a vital role. My last thought about education, by the way, and the role that it can play in getting us to want something we don't think we want. Ooh, wait, lost my train of thought. How do we get... Oh, yeah. What I was going to say was... So a lot of my thinking and research on education is that we we resist when something is really uncomfortable. Those of you who were at my last fall's presentation, not that you'll remember everything I talked about last fall, but this is one of the things that I talked about, right? Is that if we're learning something that makes us uncomfortable, if we're learning something actually that jars with the ways we already make sense of the world, that can make us quite uncomfortable. I'll give a more concrete example. So some of you work with really young kids. When you first learn addition, this is how we tend to think addition is. It's this. So those of you who work with really young kids, have you sometimes had kids who answer the question, what is 2 plus 2? Oh, it's 22. They just put the numbers there. So you actually have to unlearn what you thought was addition in order to learn what addition is. So this is happening all the time, right? Learning involves unlearning. And it happens all the time because we all have these ideas in our head of how the world works. But unlearning can make us uncomfortable, right? Oh wait, 2 plus 2 is not 22? Yeah, that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, right? So learning, which involves unlearning, can also make us uncomfortable. And this is where the theory gets really meaty, is to recognize that when I'm uncomfortable, I often resist learning. Discomfort can make us resist. So education, therefore, actually has to constantly address resistance. Now, what's the problem with education is we don't often think about resistance. Education often, common sense understanding of education is that our job is to give people more knowledge. But do you see that the more I try to ram down your throat my way of thinking, or what I think is true, the more you might actually resist. Right? This is kind of an Elizabeth Ellsworth argument, that many times the more you teach, the more they might not learn. The more you're actually working against yourself. Right? So we have to rattle what it means to teach. We have to really forefront the idea that for me to teach, I must address resistance. That was my long-winded way of saying I don't have an answer, but that is how I think about it, right? That if we want to get people to grapple with what they're really invested in, there is a starting point, and that is understanding the role of investment, understanding what we're going to be resisting.
And thinking like particularly about this moment. So folks, I assume folks' social media pages probably look like mine around immigration and engaging children. And there's been this sort of undercurrent of some folks that saying, actually this, like making the argument you made, right, that this is not new for our country. Historically we can look at Indian quote unquote boarding schools, we can look at slavery, etc. What's interesting is for me, and I think I've seen this with others, recognizing that this is something we have always done as a country doesn't make me feel more hopeful. It actually makes me feel more demoralized. And I think I've seen versions of that too when we talk about schooling sometimes, particularly with folks that want to be teachers. We convince them that like schooling actually is not about all the things that you thought it was, about justice and learning and this, it's really about social reproduction. And it can lead folks, and myself included, to sometimes feel like, well, what's the point in even doing any of this? It sort of feels like the notion or the belief that, for example, what we're doing to immigrant children right now is exceptional is what's spurring folks to action. So that's a tension I'm wrestling with of like, that we can't ignore history, and unfortunately the history of schooling in the US, the history of racism in the US, right? Like these are not new things happening in our country. How do we pair that with encouraging folks to keep pushing towards a better world?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. Thank you. That's a great question. Let me think a little bit. I'm just kidding. Yeah, so I do have I do have a couple of responses. I'm in so many ways energized by the collectivizing that's happening in this country, right? Ever since pre-inauguration day, but certainly since. Where I'm concerned is what often bubbles up as the goal of the mobilizings. So the activists, of course, are pushing for something very different than a bill that's just been presented to Congress, the Paul Ryan bill. But what I think analysts would say is that in a moment of crisis, what ends up becoming the solution? Well, too often in a moment of crisis, the solution is a horrible one, but it's one that may not have been possible were we not in a crisis, right? So I think that there's this kind of good and bad about a moment of crisis, is that it might cause really problematic policies to happen, even as it's causing great mobilizations. But even with the mobilizations, how might the mobilizations be co-opted in a problematic way? And so an example for me would be the youth mobilizations following the school shooting, right? Because the media coverage, I don't think adequately covered the complexity of what the youth were calling for, right? Because my reading of the media coverage is that students are upset at the school shooting and now they're pushing for legislation to push for stricter gun control. And I'm like, that is what they're pushing for. But there might be a bunch of other things that they're making an argument about, and why are we not talking about that, right? So long as we so long as we fail to connect the dots, I don't think that the crises are going to prove as useful as they need to be. But my second thought has to do with how. So that was my thought about hopefulness. Let's talk a little bit about demoralization, because I think that it is really arresting. It stops us, it stops me to kind of recognize the pervasiveness or the enduring nature of so many of the things we're talking about, right? Oh, that schools were never set up to level the playing field. Or, you know, the achievement, the one person was like, the achievement gap is kind of a sign that schools are succeeding, right? They're doing kind of what they're set up to do. And I'm like, yeah, in some ways that's a great way of thinking of it, right? So one way that I think about this, though, is let's go back to my favorite theorist, one of my favorite theorists, Elizabeth Ellsworth. Because Ellsworth was once arguing in, I can't remember what piece, that, so this is maybe a little bit more background than you need, but so in her book, Teaching Positions, which came out in 1997, now out of print, but you can download it for free at her website. Teaching Positions talks about what she calls the impossibility of teaching, right? And she calls she names this thing the space between. And she says there's always going to be a space between what I'm teaching and what you're learning, right? There is never going to be the exact same thing. Partly because there's always a hidden curriculum that's teaching additional things that I never intended, and also partly because you're always looking through different lenses that are not only different from each other, but that I could never predict. So there's always going to be a difference, right? And yet, the way that we think of teaching is that the more I can get you to absorb what I'm teaching, the more effective my teaching is, right? We write up our objective, and then we come up with an activity to get there, and then we assess whether or not they got there. And if they did, then we think their learning has been accomplished and my teaching was successful. And what she's arguing is that can never be the case, because there will always be a difference. There will always be the space. So I'm bringing this up because part of what she wants to acknowledge is that that can feel very uncomfortable, the idea that I cannot control what happens in a classroom, right? That there's so much unpredictability in teaching and learning, and that actually where teaching and learning is most powerful is when it's unpredictable. In fact, this was my argument about anti-oppressive teaching, right, that I was saying earlier. That if I get you to think like me, that's not actually social justice teaching at all, right? If I get you to see the gaps in what I'm teaching, that to me is a much more powerful space for some real learning and justice work to happen, right? So what she wants to acknowledge is this interesting space where we find comfort. Because she's trying to say that, well, actually, I think at our gut level, where we feel most comfortable is where we think there will be repetition, is where I can predict, is where I can control, right? Is where I can predict that you're going to learn the way I want you to learn and what I want you to learn, and that I'm going to be able to assess afterwards that that's exactly what happened. And if you put it that way, I'm like, well, yeah, of course that's what I'm looking for. I want my students to walk out of there thinking the way I want, learning what I'm trying to teach. And she's like, so here's the problem with that, right? A, let's grapple with the idea that that never happens because of the hidden curriculum and because of the lenses. But let's also grapple with the idea that I don't ever fully know anything. Name a topic. there's probably a zillion things about that topic that I do not know, even if I'm an expert on it. I think of myself, Kevin Kumashiro, as an expert on curriculum and teacher education. Yeah. Are there a zillion things about curriculum and teacher education I do not know? Yeah. I wouldn't acknowledge that when I walk into a classroom. I'd want my students to think I know what I'm talking about, right? Or I know a lot about movement building. This is my whole theme when I run events now. It's all about how can education be in the service of movement building. I think I know a lot about social movements. Are there a zillion things I do not know? Yeah. So hopefully every teacher in the room is like, well, yeah, I am a chemistry teacher. Are there a lot of things about chemistry I do not know? Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually a problem if you think you know everything, right? So, but isn't this a barrier to us often? I like to think about how many times we say, I'm a little nervous about teaching a topic because I don't know enough about that topic. I don't want to talk about race because what if a question comes up that I don't know how to answer? That's going to make me uncomfortable, right? And I think Ellsworth's point is, well, actually, but on any and every topic, there will be things you don't know. And in fact, if you take seriously the idea that teaching should involve unteaching, then there should always be questions that come up that not only you didn't predict, but that rattle the very things you're teaching, right? So, this is my long way of saying that I actually think that when we can sit in this contradictory space of schools as sites of social reproduction and schools as sites of ideological contestation or struggle, that is some of the most useful ways to think about occupying paradox. Right? Schools have always served to maintain the status quo. That is the function. That's why we often set up schools. But schools have also always been sites where societies struggle to define who we are and what we are to become. They are sites of ideological struggle, right? And if you only see one of these, I think you're missing what schools are. Our job is to actually dive into that contradiction. And just as Ellsworth would say that the impossibility of teaching is what makes teaching possible, right? Recognizing that my job isn't to make you think like me. My job is to make you question the very things I'm teaching, and that's what is possible. Same with schools. I think what makes schools as kind of democratic laboratories possible is that they occupy this highly contradictory space. And so what in practice does that look like? In practice, I think this looks like as we prepare our teachers to teach, or as we support our teachers who are already teaching, our lessons need to be about this contradiction. We need to be diving into this. There are too many of my friends who are all about, let's hammer home how schools are oppressive. I'm like, okay, yeah, but you also need to give people hope because schools do teach. We learn things in schools. And I also have people who are like, this needs to be all about the positive, the assets, the hopefulness. I'm like, yeah, schools can be powerful transformative agents. Where have a lot of modern day or modern century revolutions begun? They've been seeded at the universities. They've been seeded by teachers, right? That's why when repressive regimes arise, who do they often go after? They don't only go after the journalists and the judges and the artists. They also go after the teachers, right? Schools can be transformative, but if that's all you talk about, you're actually not getting at how we got here in the first place, right? Yeah. Last point. Even when we want to, rightfully so, demonize what's happening in this moment, and we need to, I think our analysis will never be complete if we do not connect the dots. And if we do not connect the dots, then our solution will also not be complete. Right? The one political party saying that the current leadership is falling short and we need a better solution, and everyone buying into that story puts that political party off the hook for the contributions they made for how we got here, right? So we need to connect the dots, and that's what will help us come up with a better solution. All right, thank you.